Welcome to the Mentorship Matters podcast, where we talk about leadership, life, and the transformative power of mentoring. I'm Solveig Brown, and today I am really excited to have Larry Sherrell as my guest. We are going to discuss how individuals can take charge of their self development and build their capability. By the end of this episode, I guarantee that you will learn tried and true strategies from Larry to take your self development to the next level. Before we dig in, I'm going to tell you more about Larry. Larry Sherrell is a transformational HR leader with 40 years of experience. He is currently an interim HR leader and consultant for ZRG Partners. He has worked with customers such as Abbott Laboratories, Texas Instruments, General Motors, Lexipol, Gibson Energy, and Seco Environmental Corporation. He has extensive experience in strategic planning and execution, process improvement, creative problem solving, performance management, and working in diverse industries. Larry has a passion for helping companies create cultures that drive performance and results. He has learned that creating a people strategy aligned with a business strategy is paramount to an organization achieving its desired culture, vision, and strategic objectives. Larry has a BS in industrial engineering from General Motors Institute and an MBA in organizational behavior from the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. Welcome, Larry. I am so happy to have you as a guest today.
Thank you very much, Salve. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Larry, one of the things that you are really passionate about is bringing out the best in people through development. Why is individual development so important?
Well, I can think of three reasons why it's very important. One, it really helps with achieving your career objectives. I worked with 5 emerging leaders back 15 to 25 years ago at Texas Instruments. And since that time, I've kept up with these emerging leaders. And one of them was David Reed. He's now the CEO of Vedanta. It's an Indian semiconductor organization, but he leads their semiconductor business. And then the second one is Nancy Ferris. She is a former CEO of Microline, which is a semiconductor foundry up in Edmonton, Canada. Lars Yoder has been for 10 plus years and is still the president of BenQ Americas out in Los Angeles. Adam Koonsman is currently the CEO of Visitech, a company in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And lastly is Tom, and I met him more than 25 years ago. When I worked at Abbott Laboratories, he was a sales rep. I was the HR manager for the sales force. And he came up to me in the Denver airport about 10 years later and said, "Hey, do you know who I am?" And I said, "I know your name is Tom." He said, "You're right. Do you know what I'm doing now?" I said, "No, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm the vice president of sales." I said, "Wow, congratulations. It only took you about 10 years. He said, "Yeah, I took your career planning guide that you created for the entire sales force. I mapped out my career path to get to vice president, and I got there." And so it was very good thing to see somebody had applied the information he had been given and developed his career. He was very, very happy. So it was great to see him again. That's number one. Reason number two is there have been a couple of studies, one by the American Society for Training and Development, that said that 75% of executives cited that their career growth was primarily due to mentoring. And there's a second one from Harvard Business Review, and it stated that 84% of CEOs learned and did a better job, more proficient in the roles faster with mentoring. So you can see the importance that mentoring plays in career development. And the last reason is if you work in a growing organization, the reality of it is if you don't grow with the organization, you're going to be left behind. We used to draw two triangles. One would be the organization, and then would be the individual. And so if your size stays the same, if your triangle stays the same size, and the triangle of the organization keeps expanding because you're growing revenue and profitability, you're going to stagnate.
Wow, you just made a powerful case that self-development is crucial if you want to succeed in an organization. And I appreciate that you called out that mentoring is also an important component of that self-development. How do you get people to move through their resistance to self-development?
Well, it's been my experience that most employees do resist self-development. It's just one of those things. And so there's a really good model that's used in corporate America for organizational change. It's called the change curve. So there are 4 stages in that curve. So employees, when you announce a change, Stage one is resistance. That's where everybody says, I don't want to do this. I don't think this is a great idea. Like the famous book, Who Moved My Cheese? And people just want the status quo. Phase two is resistance, and that's where people get verbal and they start expressing their dislike and their discontent for these changes. Phase three, you move from the past focused steps 1 and 2, and you move into phase three, that's exploration. So you put your foot into the future and you start looking at possibilities and opportunities. And then phase four is the final phase, and that's commitment. And that's where people finally accept the change is not going to go back to the way it was in the past. It's going to stay the way it is. They need to get on the bandwagon and go forward with the organization. If they don't, oftentimes they leave the organization. So some of the comments I've heard many times about development in organizations, my favorite is number one. It's like, I don't need any development. I'm fully developed. And my response was always, really? It's like, maybe you don't know what you don't know, because there's so many ways that you can grow and develop. Number two, I don't have time to develop myself. That takes way too much time. I'm busy Monday through Friday. I work long hours, and that would just add more work to my responsibilities, and I just can't squeeze that in. Number three, well, it wouldn't do any good if I developed myself anyway. Somebody else would get the promotional opportunities. I'm just not cut out for that. So what do? So you're trying to move people from resistance, where they're stuck in the mud, trying to get them into exploration. And so some good questions to ask is, what do you think about development, and how do you feel about it? And most people will certainly answer that question and come up with all sorts of objections. And so you just listen, absorb the objections. And then you, at some point, when they settle down, you say, what would be some of the benefits of developing yourself? Would anything be better if you invested some time in developing yourself? Have you known anybody else that has actively worked on development and they've seen positive outcomes? Oh yeah, they usually can name people who have, done better, and they were aware that they were into development. And then the last question is, what information would help you reconsider the importance of development? And people just, you're not trying to wear them down. You're trying to provide helpful information to get them to see things in a different perspective. And over time, it's been my experience that many people in resistance will start moving into exploration. The other approach that some companies do is that they just make it mandatory, and that takes away all of the objections. So if you have to do it, it's required, and that works pretty well.
Right. I appreciate that you normalized resistance, that you're saying that's more the norm, that people have resistance to it than it is that people just jump in and say, just let me start my development plan. And then I really appreciate that people can verbalize that. And then those questions that you ask kind of get people to a different mindset of opening their mindset to, like, okay, development might be a really good approach. So let's say you've moved someone from resistance to the idea that they want to start a self-development plan. Where does someone start in making a plan for their own development?
Great question, Salve. The individual development process has 3 steps. So number one, we start with our goals. Most organizations start in the first quarter of the year. Some do it later in the year, but that's most corporations. So you set your SMART goals. We all know what SMART stands for. But in addition to your professional goals, you want to think about your personal goals, and you want to think about your career aspirations. So what are your short-term and long-term career aspirations? So it really helps to set your goals and to do both professional and personal. Number two, you got to get the 360-degree feedback. Can you do it without feedback? You could, but it's not going to be very good as you're moving forward, because most of us don't really know what other people perceive about us and our strengths and our development needs. So I have found that to be very, very helpful. It's not complicated. It doesn't take a lot of time. You've got 2 options. One is to do the informal approach, and that's just as simple as talking to your peers, your boss, your direct reports, your customers. It can be internal. Sometimes it'll be external if you're in sales positions. And just ask 2 simple questions and do that anonymously. And so you can ask them, the first question is, what 2 to 4 strengths do you think are my top strengths? And then the second question is, what 1 or 2 things could I do differently to help me be more successful? And if you ask the questions that way, most employees will give you anonymous feedback. And then once you get that anonymous feedback, if you see a pattern, let's say typically the recommendations always send it out to 10 to 15 people, because that way you have enough data points and you can make some sense out of it. And so if 3 people give you the same feedback, that's usually a very strong indicator. That's something that you should focus on. And then the more formal approach, you might have to work with HR on this, but many organizations provide feedback processes. PDRI stands for Personnel Decisions Incorporated. They have a 360-degree multi-rater feedback survey. I've used it many, many years. It's exceptionally good. And you send it out to the 10 or 15 people that you want feedback from. They answer, it's probably about 100 questions, but the feedback comes back and it measures the different competencies for your position. If you're an individual contributor, there are competencies needed to succeed in that position. If you're a manager, there's a different set of competencies. And if you're a leader, an executive, director, VP, or above, then you have a different set of competencies. So it's structured based on what the competencies needed to succeed in those 3 different levels. When you get the report back, it is very comprehensive and provides you a lot of great information. It also has qualitative comments that people made anonymously. And so you get a really clear picture. The camera zeroes in pretty cleanly and clearly as to what you do well, which usually is quite extensive, and the areas for improvement, which is usually less. There's not as many of those, but those are really important. So once you spend the time on the 360 feedback, which I strongly recommend, then the next thing is to take that feedback and create a development plan for the year. And so you create this plan, and you got to start somewhere. So if you've never done it before, start small and just have 1 or 2 maybe areas of knowledge or skill. Some organizations call them competencies. It's like executive presentation skills would be a skill or a competency. Making a presentation to a large group of employees that are higher level, that's another skill. So what you do is you try to do on-the-job experiences. The Center for Creative Leadership is very active in this space. They're in North Carolina. And so you want to take 50% of your development plans should be on-the-job experiences, because that's where most of us learn. We learn on the job. So that's things like a new project. It could be a cross-functional team. Those are extremely good experiences. It could be job shadowing. And then 30% of your development plan should be investing with others. And that's where you have a mentor, you get a coach, or you find somebody who'll just listen to you, because it's really good to talk things over when you're growing and developing, because you're learning so much so fast, and it helps to process that with others. And then the third is the formal education that we often think about. That should be about 20%. So that's classes that your company offers. It could be LinkedIn Learning that you can do at home. It could be going to an executive education program at a university, or it could be like going to a leadership conference or some other conference that is of interest and that would help you expand the knowledge and skills that you have. The final step in all of this is you do have to talk with your boss, and you need to get your boss's support for your plan. And once that support is there, then you're ready to implement your plan.
I like the simplicity of that 3-step process of setting your personal and professional goals, getting the 360 feedback either informally yourself or formally if your organization offers that, and then creating and implementing your development plan, in conjunction with speaking with your manager and getting the support that you need. That is the way you laid it out makes it doable, and I appreciate the percentages of what you should do for that development plan. What are good strategies to help people move through the difficulty of growth?
Well, I can think of 4 strategies that make good sense. As we know, or as you might surmise, development is a quadrant 2 activity. We always remember the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People from Stephen Covey back many years ago. But in your time management information, box 2 is the activities that are important but not urgent. Development is hardly ever urgent. It just doesn't work that way. So it's always important. So how do people get it done? Well, people that do it well, they put it on their calendar. And that's like we have to do with any quadrant 2 activity, because if we wait until all the urgent and important tasks have been completed, development will always be at the bottom of the stack. It'll be Friday night and you got nothing done. And then you try that the next week and you have the same outcome. So I've watched people how they do that. And me personally, that's how I've done it. You put it on your calendar, you make it happen. And you also have to have goals, because if you don't have goals, those important and urgent tasks will literally just take you over. They will control your days. Number two, you have to seek out growth experiences. You need to change your mindset to a growth mindset, just like corporations do. When you're in a company and they have a growth mindset, they're going to grow the revenue of the company over the years for many different reasons and grow the profitability. You have to think like a company and look for these growth experiences, and you have to take risk, but they have to be intelligent risk, because you have a lot of learning, you pick up a lot of resilience, you're going to have setbacks, but when you have setbacks, that's where the learning occurs. A lot of times it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, process what happened. Okay, I got this, I'm ready to go. Number 3, you definitely need to seek somebody who is in your corner. It is a rare occurrence when somebody gets promoted to the upper levels of the organization who's never had someone to work with them. They all do. They have a coach, they have a mentor, they have somebody that they can talk to. Some people just literally enroll a mentor or someone to help them from a similar position in their organization at another company. And that way they can get a different perspective, because it helps when you get into these tough decisions and there's pressure to make a good decision and you're not sure exactly what to do. There's certainly a cost of making a bad decision, but if you want to make a good one, many people have people that they can contact and just get another perspective before they make that final decision. And then the last thing is confidence. You have to really believe in yourself when you're growing and developing, because you're acquiring new skills and abilities. You're expanding your horizons. And so there's always a chance of something happening that you wish that hadn't. The best example I've seen of confidence was just last week. Stephanie Pope was named the new leader of Boeing's troubled airplane unit. And her first quote was, "Out of failure comes success." So she's letting the world know she intends to turn this mess of a manufacturing company into a successful company, like it has been for many, many years. And so anyway, kudos to her for saying that. But I mean, those are the 4 strategies that I think would really help.
Yeah, those are fantastic strategies. I like that one, to schedule time for development so that you end up prioritizing it and not letting your urgent activities take over your calendar. That 2 was to seek out growth opportunities and to expand your own growth mindset. 3 was to get support from a mentor or coach. And 4, to increase your self-confidence. Thank you so much. Larry, I have read several articles lately that talk about the importance of developing strong listening skills to be a more effective leader. I have a 2-part question for you. Why is becoming a better listener so important? And how can someone become a better listener?
Well, that's a wonderful question, Salve. It does come up quite frequently. And the reason it's gotten so much more important since the pandemic is because we have people working from home. We have hybrid arrangements. We have remote employees. And when you're talking with them on the phone or even a Zoom meeting, you miss all those nonverbal cues that you pick up when you're talking with them face to face. That's the biggest part of it. And number 2, when you have top performers in your organizations, if bosses don't take the time to thoughtfully respond to them, there is a pretty good possibility they're going to leave. And we've got things going on today that we have not dealt with in the past, where they get told some information that they don't like, and they just bolt within 24 hours. And that's not how it's been in the past. And so employees have a lot of flexibility. The job market is still hot in many locations in the United States. And so retention is a big deal. In fact, it almost always shows up in the top 5 of executives' major concerns for the year. And it showed up as, I think, number 4 for 2024. The last one is, as we know, listening is just basically not taught in colleges. Only 11% of the undergraduate business programs even list listening as a learning goal. So where do people learn how to listen? And so you just hear anecdotal stories about it. But there was an article written just 2 years ago by Harvard Business Review, and it was called simply How to Become a Better Listener. And it just has some tremendous information. So the authors say that the key is to become an active listener. So what is an active listener? They define it as having two parts. Number one is you understand what the other person is saying. And number two, you convey interest, engagement, and caring. So it's sort of a rational and sort of an emotional part involved in it. So they give a number of tips on how you can become a better listener. But here are the four that I thought were the most outstanding. Number one is to repeat the last words of the person when they're talking. Don't paraphrase what they say, because when you paraphrase, it takes the conversation and it bogs it down. If you have to paraphrase, because sometimes we do, if you do, tell them you're going to paraphrase so they don't get upset, and let them know the reason you're doing that is because you really want to understand what they're trying to communicate to you. Number two is to ask more questions than you think you should. Most of us just ask maybe one question or not even one question, but the authors say that if you ask more questions, it helps the other person feel like they've been listened to, and it helps you to understand what they're trying to communicate to you. Number three is don't rehearse your response before the person gets finished talking. We all do that. Our brains, I'm told, work 4 times faster than the person who's speaking. So we're sitting there thinking of a response. And as soon as they stop, we jump in there and we come up with a response. They say, don't do that. Wait until they finished, take a brief pause, and then make your reply. Number 4, this is the big one, monitor your emotions. When we're leaders, we've all had these conversations with employees that we didn't want to hear what they were trying to say. What they say is, when that starts, slow down the conversation. And that's really good advice, because what most of us do is speed it up. It's like, I don't want to hear that. We have been over this topic many times, and I don't want to go there. That's what we're thinking when they're talking, but they say slow things down and give them the airtime and let them say what they want to say. And if you don't feel like it, this would be my suggestion, just stop the conversation and say, we'll have that follow-up conversation at a later date. And then by that time, your emotional response will go down. You can talk about a second time, and it'll be a much better conversation.
Thank you for framing the importance of listening, especially in this current era where so many people are remote. And I appreciate you highlighting some active listening techniques that people can practice with their colleagues, friends, close family members. You can practice it with everyone. So many of our mentees are going through major work transitions. How can leaders and employees navigate change more effectively?
Well, I'll tell you, change is tough at work. As we all know, it's very emotionally intense. People get upset, they get frustrated, lots of different emotions you see. So in almost all cases, they resist the changes. And why is that? Largely because they're not involved in the change. The changes are done at the top of the organization. I've always worked with the top leadership team, and we spend weeks and months coming up with the plan. And then that plan is communicated to all employees. And for the most part, that's the first time they ever know about it. So the leaders have had much time to absorb the changes and for themselves to get on board with the changes that are being made. But a couple of quotes: change is never painful, only resistance to change. That's a quote from Buddha many years ago, very true. And Robin Sharma made a good quote: change is hard at first, it's messy in the middle, and it's gorgeous at the end. So that talks about the 3 different phases that we go through. So a helpful model to understand change, the best one I've seen, it's used very commonly, it's called the Bridges Transition Model. It's named after William Bridges. And what he talks about is change is an external event. That's often like a change in business strategy or an acquisition or a divestiture. Something big happens in the organization. But transition, that's the inner psychological process that we all go through when we have to internalize what's happened and come to grips and come to terms with the new situation. And at some point, get to a point of acceptance. So what he talks about is there's 3 stages, and I've seen these in every organizational restructuring I've been through. Stage 1, curiously, is called endings. Why is that? Because the transition starts with an ending, because you lose what you've had in the past. And now you've got to learn new things. Stage 2 is called the neutral zone, and that's the messy, foggy, really anxious, in the middle step. It's between the old and the new, and things are just swirling. They're moving forward, they're going backward, they're going up, they're going down, and people are just generally in a state of malaise, is what I used to call it. And so it's a difficult step because they're going to have to, they know they've got to accept the new, but they haven't given up the old. It's almost like having one leg on one side and the other leg on the other side, and you can't decide which way to go. It's really tough. The last stage is called new beginnings. That's the better stage. Now you've completely let go. You've got both legs in one place. You're looking toward the future. You're setting your goals. You can see a future, and you're starting to get more positive as you absorb what's going on. And so an example of a large organizational restructuring, it can take literally up to 6 months for an individual to go through those 3 phases. And of course, leaders, because they've worked on the organization structure, they're already bought into the changes. And so they don't need 6 months, as they've already had it. Typically, it's a lot less than 6 months. But the employee has to, go through stage 1, that can take up to 2 months, then move to stage 2, the neutral zone, that can take 2 months. And then that final step is the new beginnings, and that can take to 2 months. So as leaders, it's imperative that we understand that and give people enough time. Just saying, hey, accept it and move on. Let's suck it up. That doesn't work, because that's just not the way people respond. It takes a long time for many employees. Some employees are better than others. Some can accept it a little more quickly, but everybody's got to go through those 3 phases. And so when you have a team and you have people that are fast adopters, well, they will go through the changes and run, but you'll have some slow people on your team, and they are struggling. And you have to know who those people are, and you have to talk with them, and sometimes you have to counsel them to get them to work through. But over time, if you will slow your approach down, your slow adopters will finally get there, and they'll be good, productive employees.
That's a really good perspective on that the top leadership who has implemented the change has had a long time to adapt to it, more so than the people that find out about it when it's announced. And that I appreciate that you said that change is emotional.
Well, I've experienced just about every emotion that an employee can experience in my career. But the key is leaders to communicate, communicate, and communicate. The second thing is you have to explain the WIFM. It's called WIIFM. It's what's in it for me. We used to call it the radio station. So employees want to know. It's like, okay, I hear you talking about all these wonderful things they're going to have from the corporation. What's in it for me? What do I get out of this? Do I just get headaches and get problems and have to work with a boss I don't like, or do a job that I don't really care about? Give me some good news, man. I want to know what's in it for me. And they're really serious when they talk that way. So you have to put yourself in their shoes. The other thing is to be empathetic. And like I said, put yourself in their shoes. If you were like a 25-year employee working with a corporation, it got sold to another company, and that company wants to take this person, let's just say they're a manager or director, and add some additional work to the job. They want to have the job report to a higher level leader that they've never known, don't know anything about that person. That amount of change is extremely high, and that can just literally turn an employee upside down. So if you can feel what they're feeling, it can definitely help you come up with a solution and help them get to acceptance.
Larry, thank you for walking us through all the nuances of change. Obviously, you are an expert in this area that you sounds like you've been through this a time or two. And even the importance of communication, of what you may think is over communication as a manager, is never over communication, and the empathy and the what's in it for me approach. Thank you. That is all really helpful. What resources, books, or tools have been particularly helpful in enhancing like a leader's emotional awareness and effectiveness during change?
Well, I have found 3 resources that have been the most helpful to me. The first one is Dr. John Kotter. He was a professor at Harvard. He has an 8-step organizational change process. He wrote a book about 25 years ago. It's called leading change. But it's almost the Bible for organizational change leaders. And basically, and I've used it in all of the organizational changes that I've had, and I've led many in my career. So if you follow all his 8 steps, you have a successful organizational change. If you say, well, I think I'll just skip number 2 and skip number 5, and let's just see if that'll work. It never works. You have to follow the 8 steps because organizational change initiatives are typically very complex. There's a lot of stakeholders involved in the process, and you've got to have everybody in the organization on board and willing and agreeable to moving forward. And again, oftentimes organizational change is 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And you reassess where you've been, where you're going, and you try something new and you keep going to get to your target. The second resource I found very helpful is the situational leadership model. 2 doctors, Dr. Paul Hersey and Dr. Ken Blanchard. Blanchard gets most of the credit for it, but it's really good for those times where you have new leaders, new employees. And so we all lead the employees that are working for us. But if you get changed and you get scrambled, your team goes away, you get new employees you've never worked with before, you get a new boss that you've never even known in your career. Wow, everything is just literally upside down, and you've got to start from ground zero. So you've got 4 different phases, and it depends on where you are with the relationship, your leadership style, and how they like to be led. And then the third resource is, we probably all heard of it, Dr. Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And that is particularly useful when you have employees that get very emotional. Because really, when you have an organizational change, it's almost like people grieve just like they grieve deaths, because they are giving up something that they've invested their many, many years, oftentimes, in their career and in their life, and all that is just completely taken away from them. And so the impact of that is very, very strong. And so you'll see these people go through the denial and anger. And so and typically at that point, when I've had those kind of situations, I call in outside counselors, because that gets beyond what HR leaders can effectively do. You need either a counselor, a psychologist, or someone like that. And they basically will meet with people, oftentimes as long and as in terms of the frequency and in the amount of time, like 30 minutes to an hour. But sometimes your slow adopters can take multiple sessions with a trained counselor to work through all those emotions. And that stuff is like, we do that outside the corporation, because that's very individual and very personal. But those are the 3 that I found to be very, very helpful.
Larry, we have time for one final question. What is your advice for up and coming leaders?
Well, that is a great question to close with, Solveig. Many of you have heard of the motivational speaker, Zig Ziglar. He's no longer with us, but he had one quote that stuck in my mind many years ago, and it said, "Success occurs when opportunity meets preparation." And there's nothing more true than that. So when we're looking for promotional opportunities, we want to grow our careers, we're always looking for that opportunity, but we don't know when it's going to occur. And if you try to plan it, it might happen, but oftentimes it doesn't. It happens on no one's schedule. But you can work on your preparation, and there's lots of things you can do to get prepared. So here are the 6 ideas that I have that I thought of. First, number 1, we talked about creating your personal and your professional goals, coming up with your 360-degree feedback, and using that to create a development plan, and then talking it over with your boss. That is one thing that all of us can do. And I've worked with many, many leaders in my career that have done that, and their efforts have greatly paid off. Number 2 is to just simply prioritize your development. And why is that? Because we all have too much to do. And sometimes you'll think, there's absolutely no way I can do development. It's just going to take too much time. But the reality is, if you start making that a priority and you think, hey, I need to go to this executive education program, it's 3 days and it's in a week. Wow, who's going to do my job when I'm off at this program? But guess what? You leave for 3 days and go to Atlanta, for example, and people will fill in the slack. And when you come back, you just pick up where you left off. Wow, I got 3 free days for my development. And you have to prioritize you to make it happen, because there's always internal customers, external customers that want more of you than you've got. And so if you prioritize development, trust me, things will work out when you're not in the office. Number 3 is to seek out growth experiences on the job. That's how we grow and develop the very best. And the Center for Creative Leadership will affirm that. They have a $15 booklet. It's called the 88 Assignments for Development in Place. It's hard to imagine they could think of 88 different ways to develop, but they did many years ago. It's a very useful tool, and you can order it online. Number 4, I've talked about coaching and mentoring. That is very important. You definitely need to have a mentor and or a coach. If you have both, all the better. Or if you have someone in other companies that you can just network with. I knew one vice president, and he learned he was an operations executive, but he knew zero about finance. What did he do? He met every Saturday morning for 3 hours with a financial expert, and he did that for a year until he finally figured out what finance was all about. And that he put a high priority on his development. And of course, it paid off because he got promoted to SVP. Number 5 is to take a look at executive education. I've been involved with many, many leaders who've gone off to executive education programs. Why? Because they're great. They work, you're away from the company, and you learn a tremendous amount of information. I've been to many of those types of programs. Harvard Business School is offering a program in the first 3 months of 2025. They're taking applications this year. It's called Developing Yourself as a Leader. It's for high-performing, emerging leaders. And there's 3 priorities. They're all really good. Formulate your leadership skill set. Number 2, build influence and grow within the organization. And 3, expand your personal and your professional network. So the network is a really important part of career growth. And the final one is, if you don't like any of those other 5 ideas, a new book just got released in late February. It's by Dr. Robert Barner, and it's called Bootstrap: How to Succeed as a Leader Through Self-Coaching. You can do your own coaching. That's a new concept. I've just heard of it in the last couple of months. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal about the same thing. So it's becoming more popular because you have more people working from home, hybrid arrangements. It's not as easy to make some of these things happen as it was pre-pandemic. So you can just do it yourself. So the most important thing to do in development, to summarize, is don't wait for magic to happen. Because as we know, magic doesn't happen. Development, you have to have a vision. You have to know where you're going, and you have to have a plan to get there. It's just like anything else. And the executives, the leaders that invest their time and commitment and energy to development, those are the ones that most frequently achieve their career goals.
Larry, I love that quote that success occurs when opportunity meets preparation. And I really thank you for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us today. You began this episode talking about 5 emerging leaders you worked with earlier in their career that prioritize their self-development. And you have made a convincing case that self-development is what sets successful people apart. You have also laid out concrete suggestions for how people can prepare to seize opportunities and be successful by focusing on self-development. Thank you so much. That is really helpful. I feel that anyone can take what you've talked about in this episode and immediately begin a self-development plan. We will post your resource suggestions on the show notes for this episode on the Mentium website. Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Mentium Matters podcast. We have many great episodes lined up, and we look forward to having you join us again next time.